Joan by Carol M Mottershead. Life plodded along nicely for a while. There were the usual disagreements that every family has. Poor Snella had his annoying habits, and I admit I have one or two myself, but I prefer to consider mine eccentricities and quirks rather than annoying little habits. Pulsnella and Scaramouche still went out drinking together, and sometimes Pulsnella would be snappy when he arrived home. I asked Scaramouche about it once, but he just said that they'd been having a bit of fun trying out a new tobacco and stuff. Pulsnella had smoked tobacco before and never had the reaction he did now. Something wasn't right and I didn't like it. I still had my reservations about Scaramouche, but as the years passed, I saw how Pulsnella and Nicholas trusted him. He was their friend, and so I found myself trusting him too. If Pulsnella was working late entertaining a new writer or interviewing new actors, and if we didn't have a lady to entertain, Scaramouche would call round and keep me company, until Pulsnella arrived home. Sometimes doing the odd jobs, like helping to fold clothes or carry in the logs for the fire, stuff that Pulsnella should have been doing. We each had our own chores, and Pulsnella often fell behind in his. Scaramouche and I eventually became comfortable in each other's company. He was the one person who had seen my puppet show and could actually hear the moral of my stories. It was like he understood my very thoughts and saw the cathartic effect the puppets had on me. He would listen to my chattering without laughing at me and my musings, and I began to look upon him as a friend. I'd never had a proper friend before, and it felt good. I finally felt I could trust someone. Then came the day I now deeply regret. I told him my secret. A secret I had never in all my days spoken of to anyone other than Pulsnella and Nicholas. I told him about the potion. I told him all. How he almost died and had been given the elixir by John Dee in 1559 on our way to England. How the elixir appeared to have side effects consisting of good health, youthfulness and immortality. I told him of my concerns for Nicholas and his slowness of growth, for at the age of 110 he was still only 56 inches, but he was still growing. I even suggested that John Dee himself may still be alive if he had taken the same elixir he had given to us. It all came out, and the moment it was out of my mouth I wished I could have turned the clocks back. It wasn't just my secret to tell. I should never have spoken of it, not even to Scaramouche. A secret is only a secret if no one else knows of it. And if the letter from John Dee were to be believed, I had just put my family in danger. I hadn't even told Pulsnella or Nicholas about the letter. What would he say if he found out, after all this time, that I'd told an outsider? I was so worried that I started to cry. Scaramouche tried to console me, promising he'd not tell anyone. We were his friends, he told me. He looked upon us as family. I was so worried about Pulsnella getting angry with me that I couldn't stop crying, and ended up telling Scaramouche even more than I intended. I told him my fears were because of the way Pulsnella had behaved in the past. How despite things going well of late, I still felt, occasionally, like I was walking on eggshells, trying not to inflame his anger. I pleaded with Scaramouche not to say anything. He told me he wasn't at all pleased with his friend, but swore to keep my secret. He said there was something he needed to tell me. Pulsnella had asked if there was anything going on between us. Scaramouche denied it, of course, telling him not to be so silly. We were friends, that was all. He told Pulcinella that he'd hoped he was a friend to all of us. I couldn't believe that Pulcinella would begrudge me this one friendship. I started to cry again, this time with a mixture of anger as well as sorrow. How had we come to this state, I wondered. What must have been going through his mind to even think such a thing? Doesn't he know after all this time that I still love him? Scaramouche sat beside me and put an arm around my shoulders. This latest revelation at least gave some indication as to why Pulcinella had been acting more strange of late. We had been rowing a lot over silly things, such as calling Nicholas the golden boy that can't do anything wrong, or having digs at him over whatever came into his mind next. Then one day, I was tired of his constant jibes and tried to ignore him. I was reading, working on the day's notices and charters. He wanted me to stop reading and listen to him. I kept on reading. I didn't want to fight. Because I wouldn't listen to him, he set fire to the charter I was holding. I threw it at him and walked away. He put the fire out and came after me, wrapping Toby's dog chain around my throat. The fight was awful. I'd managed to grab the chain before it pulled too tightly. Holding on to it, I turned quickly round, catching Pulcinella by surprise, and pushed him from me. He hadn't expected me to react the way I did. Neither did I. It was purely self-defence. He was thrown off balance, fell and hit his head on the corner of the table as he did so. There was blood everywhere. I was horrified at my behaviour. I'd never reacted like that before. I felt guilty. There was never any excuse for violence. I wiped away the blood from his wound and started to clean up the mess from the table and floor. I didn't want Nicholas to see it. Pulcinella was apologising profusely as I worked. He always apologised profusely, but I'd allowed my anger to raise up against my husband. Again. That was on me. And all he wanted was for me to listen to him. It was all my fault. I'd provoked his anger. I wasn't coping with my life. Each day it became harder for me to want to wake up. Carrying on as if all was well was becoming a joke. I told Scaramouche how I tried avoiding spending time with Pulcinella. I was going to bed before he came home, making breakfast and getting out of the house before he rose in the morning, washing or shopping until he had gone, making sure Nicholas was with me whenever I could so that he didn't get any grief in my absence. I told Scaramouche the whole dreadful story. He was shocked at how his friend had been treating me. "Dry your eyes, dear lady, for eyes like yours should not be clouded by tears," he said, wiping away a tear with his kerchief. I placed my head on his shoulder. I had said too much. Scaramouche wanted to speak to his friend about his behaviour, man to man, as he put it. I tried to dissuade him. I didn't want any trouble. I was still crying on Scaramouche's shoulder when Pulcinella came home, a little worse for wear. As he walked through the door, Pulcinella saw Scaramouche, and he saw me with my head resting on his shoulder, and Pulcinella immediately started shouting. "Joni, come here," demanded Pulcinella. "Shh! Don't disturb Nicholas. He's already in bed," I replied in a loud whisper, sitting up straight. "Joni," he started off in a low, commanding voice. I didn't move, but glanced at Scaramouche, unsure of his reaction. "Joni," he said, sounding more annoyed at being ignored. I touched Scaramouche on the shoulder as I felt him move to get up. "Joni!" he yelled more loudly. Picking up his walking cane, Scaramouche stood up to go. I was embarrassed and afraid. Arguments between husband and wife were private matters. How dare Pulcinella show himself up like this? How dare he embarrass me for that matter? Scaramouche walked over to Pulcinella, waving his cane at him, intending to tell his friend off for treating his wife so discourteously. Pulcinella must have thought his friend was about to attack him, for he grabbed the stick from Scaramouche and struck him a hard blow with such force that he was knocked to the floor. Toby, who had been settled by the hearth since he'd arrived, now jumped up to the aid of his master, barking and snapping at the heels of Pulcinella. The commotion woke Nicholas. "Stop!" I shouted, running over to Nicholas. Nicholas's anger towards his father had been growing, and I didn't want to him getting involved. "Stop! It's not what it looked like!" I shouted at the top of my voice. In his rage, Pulcinella hit Scaramouche again. As he fell, he hit the back of his head on the corner of the hearth and lay bleeding on the floor. The dog's bark grew louder and louder as he got more and more upset. Pulcinella started striking the dog to stop him from biting at his heels, and gave one almighty blow. The dog was dead. Scaramouche was still. Neighbours were at the door after hearing the commotion. A whistle could be heard. Someone had called the constable. "Look what you made me do, woman!" cried Pulcinella. The doors were flung wide as constables heaved the door open. Pulcinella, realising for the first time what he had done, his best friend lay motionless in the blood-splattered room. He had killed his best friend, his only true friend. He broke down, sobbing, as the constables took him away. Nicholas and I ran to Scaramouche, hoping to hear breathing or something. But as the constables took hold of Pulcinella, Nicholas pulled me away from the now silent body of our friend. "He didn't mean it," I called to the constable as they took Pulcinella away. Pulcinella had been caught literally red-handed, with blood on his hands. He would be executed without trial. It was my fault. If I hadn't befriended Scaramouche, if I hadn't allowed myself to trust and confide in him, Scaramouche would have never gotten so close to me. Pulcinella would have no reason to mistrust his friend. They'd been such good friends. I went to the prison and tried pleading with the constable. Pulcinella didn't mean it. He wouldn't have killed his best friend, his only friend. They refused to listen. By the time I arrived home, the body of Scaramouche was gone. I asked where he had been taken, for there would be a funeral to prepare. It was the least I could do. But no one appeared to know. No one really wanted to know, or get involved. I didn't know what to do. I felt alone. The members of the troupe offered support, but without Pulcinella to run the show, everything came to a standstill. Nicholas and I were alone, numb. I tried to be allowed to see my husband the next day, but the guards were having none of it. Last night Pulcinella had had more than just a drink, I was sure of it. Those damn Medak cigarettes. I'd heard the gossip, the way they changed people's personalities, making them act unlike themselves. They should be banned. Anything that affects the mind as badly as that should be banned. Unlike the stocks and pillory, there would be no escape for Pulcinella this time. There was only one way I would see my Pulcinella, my husband, my love. For one last time, I would have to go into the city. I might be able to catch up with him en route to the scaffold. Regardless of what he'd done, he was still my husband. I still loved him. What would I do without him? What would we all do? Later that evening, news reached me that the infamous executioner Jack Ketch was to be the executioner for the traitor James Scott, who was to be executed the same day as Pulcinella. As with murderers who have been caught red-handed, traitors receive no trial. James, the illegitimate son of Charles II, believed he should be the rightful heir to the throne, and that his uncle, James II, younger brother to his father, had no right to be King of England. Scott had rebelled against his uncle. He had taken up an army and attempted to kill him. It was automatic death for treason. He would be shown no mercy. The crowds went crazy on the morning of the executions. They knew and had seen the sadistic axeman Jack Ketch in action before. They knew too that mercy was not something he ever shown anyone. He was known for his barbaric executions. Traditionally, a good executioner should carry out his office with speed. They would sharpen their blade so that the guilty did not suffer any more nor any longer than they had to. Their punishment was enough. Not so with Jack Ketch. He was a butcher. He believed the guilty deserved what was coming to them. He was heartless and sadistic in the execution of his duties, cold and ruthless and proud of it. The crowds were loving it. A double execution, a traitor and a cold-blooded murderer, both to be executed at the hands of the most feared of executioners, Jack Ketch. Along the entire route, the crowds were baying for blood. From Pulcinella's face I could see he was still haunted by what he had done to his friend. He wasn't looking at anyone. He was lost in his own thoughts. My Pulcinella, he wasn't a cold-blooded murderer. What happened was an accident, a misunderstanding between friends. I followed the prisoner's cart as far as I could. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, that I loved him. Scott climbed onto the scaffold, Pulcinella close on his tail. Scott could be heard offering Ketch a purse of money and pleading leniency for a quick death. "My servant will give you another purse of gold if it's painless," he begged Jack. Jack just laughed. It was a joke. He would have none of it. From him there would be no mercy. To further insult James Scott, he offered the last rites from a Catholic priest. James, a true follower of the Church of England, as was his father, would have none of it, and refused any such solace. Ketch struck the first blow with relish. It wasn't a clean cut. The head remained attached to its shoulders. Unexpectedly, Scott arose and looked reproachfully at Ketch. The crowds were aghast. Ketch was taken aback. Never in all the years in his office had such a thing ever happened before. The partially severed head hung limply from the body as it fell back onto the bloodied block. So shocked was Ketch that he couldn't strike again for several moments. "I cannot do it," he was heard to cry out. "My heart fails me," continued Ketch as he flung down the axe with a curse. "Get on with it, man," cried the sheriff. "Fling him over the rails," roared the mob. Eventually Ketch picked up the axe once more. The blunt axe fell. The head still wouldn't leave its body. A third blow and the last vestiges of life fled the body, still writhing and shaking. Another blow, and another, and the body stopped moving. The head still clung to its now lifeless body, A sickened mounted soldier jumped from his horse and with a sharp dagger made the final cut to sever the head from the shoulders, which fell into the waiting basket below. It was a horrific sight to behold. The crowds were in a rage. Ketch was in danger of being torn to pieces, and he deserved it. But guards were ordered to take him away for his own safety. The memory of the demise of that poor man sickened me. It was a sight I would never be able to unsee for evermore. In the name of God, if there ever was one, no matter what crime that man was guilty of, he didn't deserve that, I thought. In all the commotion that was abound, I spied Pulcinella, first oblivious to what was going on around him. Then suddenly he seemed to become mindful of his surroundings. Pulcinella saw his moment and seized it, escaping into the crowd, hands still tied behind his back. I tried chasing after him, but there was just too many people. The soldiers were trying to disperse the crowd. Many onlookers were trampled underfoot, unable to avoid the horses' hooves. Those knocked to the floor couldn't get up in the frenzied crowd. I managed somehow to get home to Nicholas, excited yet scared. Pulcinella had escaped, but would they still be looking for him? The players, Nicholas and I, were all anxious in case the soldiers came knocking at the door. Then suddenly Pulcinella threw open and shut the door with a slam, breathless and fearful. "We have to get away," he cried. We all knew it would be for the best. King James was so unpredictable. If he was able to execute his own nephew without mercy, he may think he has to stand firm and show he's the king. Or he may see the murder of Scaramouche as unimportant. We didn't know. We just knew we had to get away, and fast, return to Europe while we could.